Within the span of a few hours on Friday, the United States sent one of the most confusing combinations of signals in this conflict so far, and the contradiction at the heart of those signals reveals something far more important than a messaging problem. It reveals a strategic inflection point that will determine how this war ends, on whose terms, and whether anyone in Washington fully controls the answer to that question right now. President Trump declared on social media that the United States was getting very close to meeting our objectives and was considering, in his words, winding down military efforts in the Middle East. Within the space of a few hours on that same Friday, his administration confirmed it was sending more troops to the Middle East and lifted sanctions on some Iranian oil for the first time in decades. 3 distinct moves, 3 contradictory directions, all issued within hours of each other. And that is precisely where the real story begins, because what looks like confusion from the outside may actually be the most consequential strategic pivot of this entire campaign. To understand what the United States is now doing, and more critically, why it is doing it now, you need to step back from the daily headline cycle and look at the structural shift that has been quietly taking place over the past week. The campaign designated Operation Epic Fury entered its 4th week on the morning of March 22nd. The campaign has moved through 2 distinct phases. The first suppressed Iran's air defenses, removed its command and control, and degraded its missile and drone launch infrastructure. By the early days of March, according to US Central Command, local air superiority over western Iran and Tehran had been established. Now something fundamentally different is being attempted, and the tools being deployed tell the story more clearly than any official statement. The US military this week deployed GBU-72 Bibi bunker buster bombs to target hardened Iranian missile sites along the coast of the Strait of Hormuz, appearing to be the first time the 5,000-pound, deep-penetrating weapons have been used in this war. That single operational detail represents the clearest signal yet of where the campaign's second phase is actually headed. Moving from long-range precision strikes designed to suppress air defenses and eliminate leadership to deep-penetrating munitions targeting hardened underground infrastructure is not an incremental adjustment, it is a fundamental change in what the United States is trying to accomplish. The first phase was about establishing the conditions for operations. The second phase is about dismantling what remains once those conditions are in place. Iranian ballistic missile launches have fallen by more than 90%, from 350 on February 28th to roughly 25 by March 14th, according to publicly available data. Drone launches tell the same story, from more than 800 on day 1 to about 75 on day 15. Those numbers, drawn from publicly available military data, confirm a trajectory that analysts describe as consistent with a systematic degradation of Iran's capacity to project force, rather than a temporary pause in activity. Iran's air defenses have been suppressed to the point at which the US is now flying non-stealth B-1 bombers over Iranian airspace, a decision that signals near total confidence in air dominance. When a military power begins deploying non-stealth heavy bombers over an adversary's territory, it is not making a subtle point. It is demonstrating operational freedom that just 3 weeks earlier would have been considered far too high risk to attempt. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely complex, and where the strategic calculation facing Washington is no longer straightforward. The second phase has exposed a problem that air power alone may not solve. Analysts note that the coalition can damage facilities, degrade infrastructure, and push Iran's program back, but cannot easily eliminate the underlying nuclear problem from the air alone, especially if fuel stocks, know-how, and hidden capacity survive. That is not a minor footnote to the campaign's progress. That is the central tension defining every decision being made in Washington right now, and it explains directly why the moves of the past 48 hours are simultaneously aggressive and contradictory. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of this tension. The near-total halt of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the key waterway through which about a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas typically passes, has created a major disruption in oil markets. Oil prices have surged, with Brent crude hitting $112.19 per barrel, triggering fears of lengthy supply disruptions and potential global economic consequences. With over 3,000 vessels stranded in the Middle East, according to the International Maritime Organization, the waterway that connects Gulf energy to global markets has effectively become inoperable. Iran, facing sustained military pressure from the air, has retained one critical form of leverage: the ability to keep that choke point closed. And that leverage is now reshaping what Washington can realistically achieve, and in what time frame. Trump originally wanted to end the war before the end of March, sources say, but the crisis in the Strait has compelled him to press on longer than he planned. The White House's own public framing acknowledged this implicitly. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the president and the Pentagon predicted it would take approximately 4 to 6 weeks to achieve this mission, and that tomorrow marks week 3. The official timeline is still intact on paper, but the Hormuz problem has introduced a variable that the original plan did not fully account for, or at least did not publicly anticipate at this scale. Inside the room, allies and advisors who have spoken with Trump describe a president divided over the war. On one hand, he is worried about the price of oil and annoyed he cannot get allies to help solve the Hormuz closure. On the other, he is focused on the measurable military results the campaign has produced. That division is not simply a matter of personality or communication style. It reflects a genuine strategic dilemma that has no clean resolution. You cannot simultaneously wind down military operations and force open the Strait of Hormuz through pressure alone, if the party controlling the strait has calculated that the economic pain of keeping it closed falls more heavily on the United States and its allies than on Iran itself. Tehran understands this, and current Iranian strategic behavior suggests it is betting heavily on that calculation holding. This is why the sanction decision, announced Friday evening, carries far more strategic weight than it appears on the surface. The Trump administration granted a temporary license, allowing Iran to sell 140 million barrels of oil sitting on tankers, enough to satisfy global demand for roughly a day and a half, according to the US Energy Information Administration. The measure is explicitly temporary, running only until April 19, 2026, but the geopolitical optics of that decision are significant. The administration's decision to lift sanctions on Iranian oil is, as US Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz framed it, very temporary and necessary to defeat the Iranian strategy of driving energy prices so high. In other words, Washington is now acknowledging publicly that Iran's economic counter-strategy, using the strait closure to impose financial pressure on the United States and the global economy, has been effective enough to require a direct policy response. That is a significant admission, even if it comes wrapped in assertive language. Meanwhile, the military posture on the ground is moving in the opposite direction from the winding down rhetoric. Even as Trump said the US was close to winding down the war, the administration announced it was sending 3 more warships to the Middle East, with about 2,500 additional Marines. The military says some 50,000 US personnel are supporting the war effort. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit and the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group have had their deployment rerouted and accelerated and are now expected to go to the Middle East. These are not routine repositioning decisions. Marine Expeditionary Units are specifically designed for rapid amphibious operations, capable of projecting force from sea to shore at short notice. Their accelerated deployment toward the region, at precisely the moment when options for Karg Island are being actively discussed inside the White House, is a coordination that analysts are reading closely. The relocation from the Asia-Pacific of 2,000 Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit has led some analysts to speculate this could be part of a plan to seize Karg Island, Iran's so-called gateway to the Strait of Hormuz. White House officials believe taking Karg Island would effectively bankrupt Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and could potentially lead to a swift conclusion to the war. But many inside the administration are wary of such a move, particularly given it would require a significant number of ground troops to achieve. That internal debate captures exactly the nature of the strategic trap that has been identified by analysts on multiple sides of this discussion. The option most likely to break Iran's Hormuz leverage is also the option that carries the highest risk of escalation, deepest troop exposure, and the most profound departure from the campaign's stated air and sea character. When asked about plans for Karg Island, Trump was deliberately evasive, saying, "I may have a plan or I may not, but how would I ever say that to a reporter?" That response, taken alongside the accelerated Marine deployment, the bunker-buster strikes along Hormuz's coast, and the White House's internal deliberations, suggests the Karg option has not been taken off the table. It may in fact be the central variable now defining the campaign's next phase. The question is not whether Washington is considering it. Based on available reporting, it clearly is. The question is whether the administration believes the military and political costs of executing it are lower than the cost of leaving the strait in Iran's hands while trying to negotiate an exit. Reports indicate some differences between the US and Israel over strategy and attacks on energy infrastructure that risk a wider economic impact, even as the two remain aligned in confronting Iran militarily. US and Israeli targets indicate diverging interests. They overlap on degrading Iran's missile forces air defenses, command structure, and parts of the nuclear program, but they diverge sharply beyond that. Israel has pursued a more expansive set of objectives, including targeting figures it views as central to Iran's internal political structure. Trump's rebuke of Israel over the South Pars gas field strike further underscored diverging aims on the question of regional destabilization. That divergence matters not only for coalition cohesion, but for what the endgame actually looks like: a military campaign with two partners who share tactical alignment but diverge strategically on end-state objectives creates compounding complications as the campaign moves toward its conclusion. The weapons transition underway tells a related story. According to CENTCOM, the US has utilized more than 20 distinct weapons systems across air, sea, land, and missile defense forces. The US has employed Tomahawk cruise missiles from Navy destroyers, deployed the Precision Strike missile for the first time, and also deployed the low-cost uncrewed combat attack system, a drone system for strikes. The transition from high-cost, long-range standoff weapons toward lower-cost precision munitions and combat drones reflects the standard pattern of an air campaign that has degraded opposing air defenses sufficiently to allow closer, more cost-efficient delivery systems to operate. It also signals an intent to sustain operations over a longer period without the per-strike expenditure that characterized the opening phase. The shift is both operational and economic, and both of those dimensions matter equally at this stage of the campaign. Iran's retaliatory attacks have targeted several sites across Israel, as well as oil refineries, US military bases, airports, and commercial shipping across the 6 Gulf states and beyond. Bahrain's defense forces have intercepted and destroyed 143 missiles and 242 drones since Iranian attacks began. Saudi Arabia reported intercepting at least 47 drones, including a concentrated barrage of 38, within just 3 hours. The scale of defensive interceptions being conducted by Gulf states illustrates how broadly the operational theater has expanded. What began as a bilateral campaign has drawn in regional defensive networks across the entire Gulf architecture. The bandwidth required to maintain that level of interception activity is not unlimited, and Iran appears to understand that sustained pressure on regional air defense systems imposes its own form of cost, even when individual interceptions succeed. Iran's supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who has not been seen in public since becoming supreme leader following strikes that killed his father, said in a statement that the US-Israeli war was a gross miscalculation. That public framing, issued during Nowruz celebrations, serves a domestic function as much as a strategic one. Iran's new leadership is consolidating its political legitimacy at a moment of intense military pressure, and projecting defiance rather than exhaustion is central to that process. Whether that messaging reflects the actual internal calculus in Tehran, or is designed to obscure a leadership in a more constrained position than it publicly presents, is a question that intelligence analysts are actively trying to answer. The Pentagon has asked for an additional $200 billion from Congress to fund the war, sending another mixed signal about how long the administration expects the conflict to last. That request, coming alongside the winding down rhetoric, is perhaps the single most revealing indicator of where the campaign's actual timeline stands. Requesting that level of additional funding does not align with a campaign approaching its conclusion in days. It aligns with a campaign whose planners are preparing for a longer duration than the public messaging has suggested. The gap between stated and implied timelines is where the real strategic intent lives. Trump wanted NATO countries and other allies to send warships, minesweepers, and aircraft as part of a coalition to reopen the strait, but the response from allies has been limited. Bahrain has become the first regional country to signal willingness to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, joining EU nations, Japan and Canada. That coalition's formation is proceeding, but not at the pace or scale Washington appears to have hoped for when the campaign began. The burden of managing Hormuz security, the ongoing interception campaigns, and the broader strategic pressure on Iran is falling disproportionately on US assets. That distribution of effort defines the long-term sustainability question that Washington cannot yet fully answer. What has changed in the past 48 hours is not simply the tone of US statements. Something more structural has shifted. The campaign has reached the point where the first phase's objectives have been largely achieved by current assessments. The second phase's objectives are clearly defined but contested in their achievability, and the exit conditions remain unresolved because the Strait of Hormuz has not reopened. The simultaneous signals of winding down and deploying more Marines, lifting sanctions on Iranian oil while striking hardened missile sites, and considering Karg Island occupation, while ruling out open-ended ground operations, are all expressions of a single underlying reality. Washington is managing the gap between what the campaign has accomplished and what it needs to accomplish before it can end on terms it considers acceptable. The signals to watch now are specific. Whether the USS Boxer and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit receive orders consistent with a Karg Island operation rather than a holding posture will be the clearest indicator of Washington's actual decision, regardless of what is said publicly. Whether Trump's April 19th sanction deadline is extended or allowed to expire will reveal how much leverage Washington believes it retains over Iran's economic calculus. Whether Iran's missile launch rates, already reduced by over 90% from their peak, continue to decline or begin to stabilize at a sustained level will indicate whether Tehran is rationing for endurance or genuinely approaching the limits of its available launch capacity. And whether the new Iranian supreme leadership in Tehran moves toward any form of back-channel engagement in the weeks ahead, given the Omani diplomatic channel that remained active until the war began, may ultimately determine whether this campaign concludes through military resolution or negotiated off-ramp. Analysts have suggested it may require the presence of US forces on the ground to ultimately secure the strait. That assessment sits at the center of the most consequential decision the Trump administration now faces. Every other question is secondary to it. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.